Rise of Nations is a phenomenal game. Shout out to Stephen Bryant, the guy who's essentially our mascot at this point, for turning me on to this game way back in college. But it's amazing. Back when I played Empire Earth and did that quick review, I felt like it wasn't the best alternative to Age of Empires because it's a little too similar and it doesn't feel as high quality necessarily. But I don't know why I didn't think to talk about Rise of Nations. Rise of Nations has resource management. The military units come out in squads, some of them, and you have a lot more factions to choose from. There's a lot more buildings. There's a huge tech tree. There's so much stuff to research. All the buildings have a different purpose, and there's a whole economy focus to the game that Age of Empires and other real-time strategies really don't focus on. I mean, you really have to focus on your economy while fighting whatever war you're trying to fight if you want to stay ahead in the game. And one of the other fascinating parts about it is that it has wonders, kind of like Sid Meier's Civilization. Each wonder has its own benefit to your faction or civilization, and it has all kinds of different buffs that help you throughout the game. It's very, very complex, down to the fact that there's attrition. If you enter enemy borders, you start taking damage unless you bring like a supply wagon or something to counteract that. There's just so many things to keep track of, and I played a game just so I could throw it in the background while talking about it, and there's a point where I'm fighting a two-front war, and I'm still having to deal with all the buildings and stuff like that. It's a phenomenal game with its own little weird single-player campaign mode, but the random skirmish mode's where it shines. Awesome game. Pick it up if you haven't. If you're still around and you still want to hear me rant about this game, I'm going to talk about a little bit of its weirdness in depth and a little bit of its complexity, and just show you why this game stands on its own and doesn't deserve to be considered an Age of Empires 2 clone. So when you start with a town, you can think of this as like the town center in Age of Empires. And this is where you create your villagers out of. But you can also fill it with villagers to increase it to a city or a metropolis. They have their own titles and stuff. And that brings its own buffs and expands its area of influence. But you can also build more cities. And you have to build them within your borders. And the borders is kind of how big they are based on your buffs from your temples and stuff like that. And if you build another city, it extends your borders a little bit more, and it just creates an area of control. And that's the big thing about Rise of Nations. You got to have map control because there's even unique resources on the map that you have to send a merchant to exploit to get the extra gold from it. Now, it's kind of difficult to structure this in a way without having to refer to a different mechanic. Like I'm talking about cities, and now I'm talking about merchants and borders and attrition, and that's because everything is effectively interwoven. It's one of these games where you don't have to focus on a specific thing and ignore something else. You have to balance all of these resources effectively and efficiently in order to have a functioning army. You can kind of win passively because there's several different victory types. If you control so much part of the map, or you have so many wonders, or if you picked one of the specific game modes. But eventually the enemy is going to attack you, and you need to have a defense. And having that defense requires a good economy, because every time you spawn, say, a villager or a military unit, the cost goes up. So you can't just keep spamming units out at the same value. I mean, eventually at the late game, you have so many resources that it doesn't really matter. But in the very early moments of the game, you really need to have an idea down of what kind of route you're going to take, because resources are very, very limited. It boils down on what your strategy is. Do you want to go for an expansionist strategy like I do, where you play as the Russians who get a boost to their attrition damage when enemies enter their borders? Or do you want to play as someone else who is really good at turtle shelling and having an early army? Regardless of what you choose, you have to make sure you're producing the right amount of resources and you spend them wisely, because there is a resource cap. It's called the commerce limit, and it depends on how many cities you have, your tech, and all the stuff you can research at temples and universities. Oh God, I kind of forgot about the universities. Knowledge is a currency, and you need you need universities for that, and hire scientists and Buffett and stuff. But anyway, it's a whole other thing. But that commerce limit is exactly that. It's a limit. It limits you to how much you're allowed to gather. So even if you're low on wood, you can't just make more lumberjacks and make more wood, because there's a limit. And I kind of like this. It makes the early game a lot more thoughtful than just who can spam the most villagers and have the most of a specific resource and win. Because if you could have unlimited farms with unlimited commerce limit, it would honestly break the game, because you're only limited to like 5 farms or 4 farms at the start, and it only gives you like 60 food per second or whatever. And or not per second. I'm not really sure what the time is, but it makes it rather difficult to juggle, and it's very intense. I don't have a whole lot of time in Rise of Nations, and that's because the matches last a long time and they stress me out. I have to be in the mood for Rise of Nations. I have to be in the mood to panic and struggle. But it's a phenomenal game that I'm trying my best to describe how it works. And yeah, you can like make caravans and go from each part of your town to make money internally. Yeah, there's a lot to it. And this thing's supposed to be like an in-depth guide, but this is more meant to show you kind of how deep it is and how complex it is and how awesome it is. And this is mainly a quick review. Anytime I talk about strategy games, I'm afraid of getting too in-depth into it, because I know it'd be probably boring unless someone's really into the game. So this is more of a quick review, like with Age of Empires and Empire Earth, just to show you that this is a game that you need to play if you haven't played it yet. I'm Elijah Blackwell, CD-ROM Fossil, and if you would like an in-depth video of Rise of Nations, or Empire Earth, or Age of Empires, or any strategy game, I'll do it, but I'm just afraid I'll put in all that work and no one will watch it. So this is a quick review. Go buy it if you haven't yet. And you know how I talked about the borders? Well, I'm going to end this video with just showing you the borders using this mini-map in the game I played. Watch the borders grow and watch as I take out towns. And when you take out a city, you actually have to defend that city for a certain amount of time so it'll assimilate to your faction. You don't capture it right away. It adds a whole another layer to the combat. But yeah, watch this mini-map and enjoy the awesome soundtrack. And just look at how insane and crowded this game gets. And I'm yellow, by the way, if you want to track my progress.